this video, we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system, a subsection of the peripheral nervous system, the meninges and the blood-brain barrier as structures for protection, and ventricles that facilitate the redistribution of waste products from the central nervous system. So we'll start off talking about the peripheral nervous system. I'm going to divide it up into 4 different divisions. First thing is that the peripheral nervous system has a sensory and motor division. Sensory receptors will convey information picked up from the environment, and this information is then transferred to the brain, and this is an afferent pathway. In a motor pathway, nerve fibers will travel from the brain and spinal cord to muscles, making them contract, and this is an efferent pathway. The second section of the peripheral nervous system we're going to be talking about is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system essentially controls the non-voluntary, unconsciously regulated processes within the body. So the 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division stimulating the fight or flight response, increasing heart rate, involving the neurotransmitters noradrenaline and adrenaline, and the parasympathetic response, which results in the rest and digest response, where heart rate decreases, more blood is supplied to the stomach for digestion, and the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is activated. So yeah, just to explain that, the sympathetic, the fight or flight response is when heart rate increases, blood vessels will constrict. It involves the activation of hormones and neurotransmitters such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. The parasympathetic response is, like I said, it's the rest and digest response. It's where the heart rate will decrease, blood vessels will dilate, they'll expand, and this involves the activation of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Which is a neurotransmitter. Great. It's not like adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are hormones and neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is just a neurotransmitter. It does not get released into the bloodstream. Okay, great. So that is just a second section of the peripheral nervous system I wanted to talk about. That's really important, and some subdivisions that are also very relevant. Third section is the enteric nervous system. This is located in the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. It essentially is responsible for the control of digestive activity, so peristalsis and secretion of enzymes, so it facilitates this digestive process, and it senses physical and chemical conditions of the gut. It interacts with the brain and can also function independently, and uses neurotransmitters including dopamine and serotonin. And something that I found really interesting as well is that the role of the enteric nervous system is really important in investigating the relationship between the brain and the gut in terms of how mood and psychological conditions are influenced by the gut itself. In walls of gastrointestinal tract, dopamine and serotonin. And it's really important in particularly treating psychological conditions and how they're influenced between this relationship between the gut and the brain. Okay, so those are 3 parts of the peripheral nervous system that I wanted to go over: the sensory and motor pathways, the autonomic nervous system and its 2 subdivisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, and finally the enteric nervous system located in the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, moving on, we're going to be talking about the CNS, the central nervous system. So just a fun fact for your knowledge, the brain itself is estimated to contain about 86 billion neurons. The brain and spinal cord themselves are protected by 3 important structures. So we're going to write that down now. Okay. So yeah, the brain and spinal cord are protected by 3 really important structures. The first structure is bone. The second structure is the meninges. And the third structure is the blood-brain barrier. Bone is the skull. It's the hard case around the brain and spinal cord, and it provides strong physical protection. The meninges is a flexible sheet between the brain and spinal cord and bone, and it's actually made from 3 different membranes. So we'll go over the meninges. So the meninges flexible sheet between the brain and spinal cord, and it consists of 3 membranes. So the first membrane is the dura mater. The second membrane is the arachnoid mater. And the third membrane is the pia mater. The dura mater is actually the outermost membrane, and it's thick and tough, and it wraps around the brain itself. Quite a hard membrane. The arachnoid mater is situated between the dura and pia mater. It's quite a spongy structure, providing a lot of shock absorption to the brain. It's the site of a lot of blood vessels which supply blood to the brain, and in itself it's actually filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Great. And the final membrane making up the meninges is the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. It's very fragile and thin, and it follows all contours of the brain itself, following all around the cortex. It's quite a fragile and thin layer. Great. So that's just an overview of the membranes that make up the meninges, the flexible sheet between the brain and spinal cord. Now we're going to be talking about the third structure that protects the brain and spinal cord, and that is the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier consists of blood vessels supplying blood to the CNS, and these specific blood vessels have special walls restricting entry of many chemicals into the central nervous system. Capillaries themselves in the brain have very small pores, restricting what can actually enter into the space of the brain. Having small entry points. That's just an overview. I'm going to quickly just summarize that one more time. So the brain and spinal cord are protected by bone, the meninges, and blood-brain barrier. The bone is skull, providing strong physical protection around the brain and spinal cord itself. The meninges is a flexible sheet between the brain and spinal cord and consists of three membranes. The three membranes are the dura mater, the outermost thick and tough layer, the middle membrane, the arachnoid mater, which is spongy and provides shock absorption. It's also the site of blood vessels which supply blood to the brain, and this membrane is actually filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is the innermost fragile and thin layer, and this follows around all the contours of the cortex itself. Finally, the blood-brain barrier consists of blood vessels having small entry points, which restricts what can enter the central nervous system. Just an interesting fact about the blood-brain barrier is that older antihistamine medication would actually be able to bypass this blood-brain barrier, and that's why certain side effects of this medication would be drowsiness and fatigue. In recent times, though, there has been efforts made by chemists to actually make antihistamine medication that is able to stop the histamine production at sites where there is an inflammatory response, but this medication cannot bypass the blood-brain barrier. Okay, ventricle. Okay, we're going to be talking about ventricles. Okay, ventricles are essentially a series of interconnected fluid-filled cavities within the brain, and they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So I'm just going to talk about that waste disposal process. So essentially what happens is the ventricles start off being interconnected, and they connect in a space in the back of the brain called the fourth ventricle. This connects to a tube called the cerebral aqueduct, and this travels down the spinal cord, and at the bottom of the spinal cord the waste fluid passes out and enters into circulation, and it is removed through the kidneys and into urine, and where it is expelled out of the body. Are interconnected in a space of the brain called the fourth ventricle, and this connects to the cerebral aqueduct. And the cerebral aqueduct passes fluid all the way down the spinal cord, and at the base of the spinal cord, fluid passes out and enters circulation. So I'm just going to say cerebral aqueduct to CA, down spinal cord, and at the base of the spinal cord, fluid is passed out into the circulatory system. And then from the circulatory system, it is filtered by the kidneys and removed via urine. Okay, that is the video on the peripheral nervous system and the sections that make up the peripheral nervous system, such as the autonomic system, the motor and sensory pathways, the enteric nervous system, as well as the central nervous system and structures that help protect the brain and spinal cord. These are all processes and structures that I actually recently learned, and I just wanted to share. Hopefully this video helps you understand some of these concepts a little bit better. It definitely helped me solidify my knowledge in these newly learned topics, and that's all we're going to be covering in this video.